Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you spent half your life making sure they had everything you didn't, only to realize one day that they had become so used to your sacrifice they no longer noticed what it was costing you? Have you ever sat at a family table, surrounded by cake and laughter and children's voices, and suddenly felt something inside you go cold because one simple question exposed a lie you didn't even know had been told about you? And what would you do if at your own grandson's birthday dinner, your son looked across the table and asked, "Dad, why aren't you living in the house I built for you?" And the only honest answer you had was, "What house?" There are some wounds that don't arrive like a slap. They arrive quietly. So quietly, in fact, that for a second your mind refuses to believe what your ears just heard. That's what happened to me. One moment I was watching my grandson smear frosting on his cheek and laughing the way old men laugh when they think, this right here is why I held on through all the hard years. And the next moment, I was sitting there frozen, looking at my son, trying to understand why he was speaking to me like I had been part of a story no one had ever bothered to tell me. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment so small from the outside that nobody across the room would know your whole heart had just shifted inside your chest. Because that's the cruel thing about family betrayal. It rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it hides in a sentence. Sometimes it hides in what everybody else at the table already seems to understand except you. And sometimes the deepest humiliation is not what was taken from you. It's realizing how long other people assumed you would stay quiet enough not to ask where it went. I had spent years trying not to be a burden. That was always my way. Don't ask for too much. Don't make the young people feel guilty. Don't put your loneliness on your son's shoulders just because he has his own life now. If something gets delayed, be patient. If a promise gets vague, don't press. If love comes to you in pieces, teach yourself to be grateful for the pieces. A lot of fathers from my generation live like that, though we don't say it out loud. We tell ourselves we're being strong. We tell ourselves we're giving our children freedom. But sometimes what we're really doing is making it easier for people to disappoint us without consequence. And that night at my grandson's birthday dinner, that quiet old habit nearly broke me. Because when my son asked that question, the whole table changed. I felt it before I understood it. I saw it in the split second after his words left his mouth. The way his face tightened, the way he stopped looking at me and turned to his wife instead. The way she went pale so fast as if the blood had been drained right out of her. The way the room, full of family just 1 second earlier, suddenly became a place when nobody wanted to be the first to speak. That kind of silence only happens when everyone realizes the truth has slipped out too early. All I knew in that moment was this: there was a house. Somehow, somewhere, there was a house everyone thought I knew about. A house my son said he had built for me. A house I was apparently not living in. And whatever came next, whatever explanation they were all silently choking on, was going to tell me something I didn't want to know. Not just about the house, about my place in my own son's life. That's the part that hurts the most as a parent, especially when you get older. It isn't the money, it isn't the inconvenience, it isn't even being left out. It's the possibility that your child has slowly stopped seeing your heart as something that needs protecting, that they've started treating your love as permanent enough to survive any silence, any excuse, any lie. And that fear lives in more parents than people admit, especially fathers, especially the quiet ones, the ones who worked, provided, drove old trucks, skipped little luxuries, fixed what was broken, ate last sometimes themselves, and never asked to be celebrated for it. The ones who thought if they gave enough, loved enough, and stayed steady enough, their children would naturally understand what loyalty looks like. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes children grow up loved and still become careless. Sometimes they don't mean to be cruel, but they become weak in the face of other people's comfort. And weakness, when it comes from your own child, can feel a lot like betrayal. So when my son looked at me that night and quietly said, "What house?" I wasn't only asking about lumber and walls and a roof. I was asking a much bigger question, though I didn't know it yet. I was asking, what have you all decided about me while I was busy trying not to ask for too much? What story have you been living in that somehow left me outside it? And why does everyone at this table suddenly look like they know the answer except me? If you have ever loved your children enough to swallow your own needs so they could breathe easier, if you have ever sat in silence because you thought asking for the truth might make you look needy, if you have ever feared that aging means slowly becoming the person everyone speaks around instead of to, then stay with me. Because what came out at that birthday table didn't just expose a secret about a house. It exposed the kind of lie people tell an old father when they are counting on his love to keep him from asking questions. To understand why that question at the dinner table hit me like a physical blow, you have to understand the kind of life I've lived. I'm 62 years old now, and if you saw me on the street, you'd probably just see another tired man with a limp and calloused hands. But behind those hands is 30 years of construction. 30 years of lifting beams in the freezing rain, climbing ladders with knees that felt like they were full of broken glass, and coming home covered in enough sawdust and drywall mud to fill a bucket. I didn't do it because I loved the work. I did it because I loved my son, David. My wife passed away when he was only 8. Cancer took her fast, leaving me with a mortgage I couldn't afford, and a little boy who looked at me like I was the only thing standing between him and the dark. I was 38 then, and from that day on, my life wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to him. I made a promise over her casket that I'd give that boy everything we never had. I wanted him to use his mind, not his back. I wanted him to be the man who designed the buildings, not the one who bled to put them up. And he did. God, I was proud. When David graduated as an engineer, I sat in that stadium and cried like a baby. My hands were scarred and my back was permanently hunched, but he was standing there in that cap and gown with a future as bright as the sun. He got the big job, he bought the big house in the suburbs, and he married a woman named Sarah, who seemed at first to appreciate everything he had become. I stayed behind in the old double-wide trailer we'd lived in since the 90s. It was drafty in the winter, and the roof leaked every time it rained hard, but it was paid for. It was my quiet little corner of the world. But as the years went on, and the winters got colder, my bones started to tell me that I couldn't keep doing this forever. The trailer was 45 minutes away from David's new life, and some nights, sitting there alone with the wind whistling through the window frames, the loneliness felt heavier than any bag of cement I'd ever carried. That's why about 2 years ago, when David came over and sat on my sagging porch, I felt a spark of hope I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. He looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "Dad, you shouldn't be out here alone anymore. I'm building a small guest house on our property, just for you. It'll be warm, it'll be close to the grandkid, and you'll never have to worry about a leaking roof." I remember trying to play it cool. I didn't want to seem desperate. I told him he didn't have to do that I was fine. But inside, I was already imagining it. I was imagining waking up and walking across the grass to have coffee with my grandson. I was imagining a bathroom where the pipes didn't freeze every January. I was imagining being a part of a family again, instead of just a visitor who had to drive nearly an hour home in the dark. It was the first time in my life I felt like I was being taken care of, instead of being the one doing all the taken care. He showed me the plans. He showed me where on the lot it would sit, tucked behind some oak trees for privacy. It felt like the reward at the end of a very long, very hard road. But then, time started to move, and the house didn't. Every time I asked about it, David had an answer ready. The permits were delayed, the contractor was backed up, the lumber prices had spiked, and they had to wait for things to cool down.
He sounded so sincere, so stressed by the complications, that I felt guilty for even bringing it up. I started telling myself, "Don't be that guy, Bill. Don't be the nagging father. He's doing this out of the goodness of his heart, and you're acting like he owes it to you." So I went back to my trailer. I spent 2 more winters wrapped in 3 blankets, listening to the space heater click and rattle all night. I drove my old truck back and forth for Sunday dinners, always arriving with a smile and a gift for my grandson, and always leaving before it got too late so I wouldn't have to drive the highway in the fog. I watched David and Sarah's life get bigger and shinier. They got a new SUV, they put in a pool, and every time I pulled up their long driveway, I'd look over towards those oak trees, half expecting to see a frame or a foundation, but there was nothing but grass. I convinced myself that maybe they'd run out of money, or maybe Sarah really didn't want me there and David was too embarrassed to tell me. I decided right then that I'd never ask again. I'd just be grateful for the dinners. I'd just be the quiet, dependable old man who didn't need anything. I didn't know that while I was shivering in that trailer and feeling guilty for being a burden, a whole other story was happening just 45 minutes away. I didn't know that the delays weren't about permits or prices. I didn't know that the house I'd been dreaming about was already standing. And I certainly didn't know that the reason I wasn't living in it was a secret so ugly it was about to turn my grandson's birthday cake into the most bitter meal I'd ever eaten.
When I made the decision to stop asking, the whole thing turned into one of those quiet humiliations a man carries by himself because he doesn't know where else to put it. That was the real conflict, long before the birthday dinner. Not just that there was supposed to be a house and there wasn't. It was the way every month that passed forced me to choose between my own hope and my own pride. Every time I started to wonder what was really going on, I'd hear my own voice in my head telling me not to push. Don't make him feel guilty. Don't make this awkward. Don't become an old man begging for a promise to be kept. So I did what a lot of fathers do when they're hurt by their children. I made excuses for him before he even had to ask. I told myself David was under pressure at work. Engineering deadlines, mortgage payments, a wife, a child, responsibilities I understood better than he probably knew. I told myself maybe building anything these days really was more complicated than it used to be. Permits, zoning, costs, inspections, all of it. I work in construction. I know how jobs can get delayed. I know how one issue leads to 3 more. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt over and over, until the doubt became a kind of habit. And habits, especially painful ones, can start looking like a lot of loyalty if you live inside them long enough. He would mention the house every now and then, usually just enough to keep the idea alive without ever giving it shape. "We're getting closer, Dad. A couple more things to sort out. I haven't forgotten." Those little lines did something cruel to me because they kept hope from dying cleanly. If he had just said, "It's not happening," I could have grieved it and adjusted. But he didn't. He fed it in crumbs, just enough for me to keep imagining a life where I woke up near my grandson, where I could hear little feet running across a yard instead of sitting alone in a trailer listening to wind rattle old siding. Hope can be a hard thing for old men. We don't always know what to do with it when it comes late. We don't trust it fully, but we don't know how to set it down either. So I waited. I waited through the winter when the kitchen pipes froze and I had to use a hairdryer under the sink just to get running water. I waited through summer storms that made the whole trailer shake at night. I waited through phone calls where David sounded rushed, distracted, loving enough to keep me from asking difficult questions, but never quite present enough for me to feel I could press him. And the whole time, I kept showing up for them. Birthday parties, Sunday dinners, soccer games, last-minute babysitting when Sarah had errands and David got stuck at work. I was good enough to call when they needed help. Good enough to come over and fix a cabinet hinge, hang a shelf, patch drywall, assemble some impossible toy at Christmas. I never minded that. I loved being useful. Maybe too much. Maybe that was part of the problem. Men like me are often easier to disappoint because we have spent our whole lives proving love through service. We don't know how to demand much in return without feeling ashamed of ourselves. There was one afternoon about a year into the waiting that still comes back to me sometimes. David had asked me to come over and help him reinforce part of the back fence.
The old posts were leaning, and with the dog and the little boy running around, he didn't want to put it off any longer. So I drove early with my tools in the truck bed, and we spent half the day out there in the heat, digging, lifting, setting concrete. My knees were screaming by the time we finished, but I was happy. Happy just to be there, to feel useful, to have my grandson running around handing me little plastic dinosaurs and asking if Grandpa could fix those too. At one point, I wiped the sweat from my face and looked toward the back of the property, toward where David had once said my little place would sit. I asked, trying to sound casual, "You still thinking of putting it right over there?" He didn't look at me. He just kept tightening a bolt and said, "Yeah, eventually. We hit a few setbacks." That was all. No details, no eye contact, just eventually. And I remember standing there with dirt on my boots and pain in my back and feeling that old familiar confusion rise in me. Not anger, not yet, just the strange ache of realizing that someone can answer you without actually letting you in. He had become good at that, good at sounding like a son who cared while still keeping me at arm's length from the truth. I told myself not to push again. I laughed, said something about projects always taking longer than people think, and we moved on. That became our pattern. Me opening a small door, him gently closing it before I could see what was behind it. I think what made it so painful was that I knew deep down something was off. Men my age don't always talk about intuition, but we have it. We just call it a feeling in the gut. Mine kept telling me there was more going on than he was saying. Not because he was a cruel man, but because he had started sounding like a man carrying someone else's decision. That's different. I couldn't have explained it clearly at the time, but I felt it. The hesitation, the too neat excuses, the strange way Sarah would go quiet if the subject came up in front of her, the slight tightening in the room whenever my future living situation got mentioned. It wasn't enough to prove anything, just enough to make me feel foolish for hoping and disloyal for doubting all at once. And that's a miserable place for a father to live, because if your son is lying to you, that hurts. But if he's not lying and you suspect him anyway, that hurts too. Either way, you're carrying something heavy and doing your best not to let it show. So I did what I had always done in hard times. I made myself smaller. I talked less about the future. I stopped glancing toward the back of the property. I stopped mentioning how cold the trailer got. If David asked how I was doing, I gave him the same answer every father gives when he doesn't want to trouble his child. I'm fine. It's such a dangerous sentence, that one. I'm fine. It protects people from your pain while slowly teaching them they don't have to look too closely. I told him I was fine when the trailer steps started rotting. I told him I was fine when the heating bill climbed too high one month and I ate more canned soup than usual to balance it out. I told him I was fine when I sat in that little living room at night with the television on for noise, because silence in old age can start to sound too much like abandonment. I told him I was fine because I thought that was what a good father did. You don't make your son choose between guilt and comfort. You choose for him. You choose his comfort every time. And maybe that was the curse of it. My goodness made the lie easier to maintain. David knew I wouldn't make a scene. He knew I wouldn't press him in front of other people. He knew I wouldn't call every week asking for updates or demand to see receipts or timelines. He knew I had too much pride to sound needy, too much love to corner him, too much old-fashioned father in me to ever say, "Son, you made me a promise, and I deserve the truth." So he let the months keep passing. And with every month that passed, the gap between what he told me and whatever was really happening grew wider and harder to explain. Lies work like that. The longer they go on, the more ordinary they start to feel to the people telling them. What feels shocking to the person receiving the truth often feels almost routine to the people who have been managing it little by little the whole time. There were moments, of course, when I thought maybe I should just ask directly. Sit him down and say, "Look, son, either the house is happening or it isn't. I can handle either answer, but I can't handle living in between forever." But every time I imagined saying it, I also imagined his face, the guilt, the irritation, the possibility that I would force him into an uncomfortable confession he was clearly trying to avoid. And because I had spent my whole life protecting him from pain where I could, I kept backing down. Isn't that something? A father can break his back for his child and still be afraid of making him uncomfortable with a simple question. That's what people don't understand about good fathers sometimes. We're not weak. We are just used to carrying the heavier thing ourselves if it means our children don't have to. But then there was Sarah. I have to be honest about her too, because she was part of the conflict even before I knew how deeply. She wasn't rude to my face, not in any obvious way. Always polite, always asking if I wanted more potatoes, more tea, another piece of pie. But there was a distance in her kindness, a kind of hospitality that felt managed rather than warm. I didn't see her as a bad person, not exactly, but I never quite felt wanted around her. Tolerated maybe, included where necessary, appreciated for what I could do. But wanted? No, there's a difference. And old men can feel that difference even when they pretend not to. I remember one Sunday afternoon when my grandson had run into my arms yelling, "Grandpa," and I had lifted him up a little too quickly, forgetting for a second what age had done to my shoulder. The pain shot through me so sharply I had to put him down and sit. Sarah came over with that same smooth politeness and said, "You have to be careful. You're not as young as you used to be." It sounds harmless written down. Maybe it was meant harmlessly. But the way she said it, the look that came with it, made me feel not cared for, but assessed, reduced, like a man becoming inconvenient around the edges. And standing there behind her, David said nothing. He just smiled tightly and changed the subject. Again. Always again. That became the real conflict before the birthday dinner ever happened. Not one big betrayal, but 1,000 small silences that all bent in the same direction, toward my exclusion, toward my not asking, toward their comfort being maintained by my willingness to stay quiet. I was still invited, still loved in the broad and easy family sense, still useful. But there's a painful difference between being loved and being considered. Loved means they're glad you come for cake. Considered means they think about what happens when you leave. Loved means they call on Sundays. Considered means they tell you the truth before the lie gets old. Loved means your grandson runs to the door. Considered means your son doesn't let you sit in a cold trailer for 2 winters while speaking vaguely about a future he has no intention or no permission to give you. And because I did not know the truth yet, I kept blaming time, money, logistics, life, everything except the thing that was really happening. I told myself people got overwhelmed. I told myself plans changed. I told myself I had no right to feel hurt over something I had never been promised in writing. But I had been promised. Not on paper, in the oldest way a father and son understand promises. Face to face, eye to eye. A simple statement from a son who knew exactly what it would mean to a man growing old alone. That is what made the conflict so deep. It wasn't about real estate. It was about trust, wearing the clothes of practicality until the day it finally split open at a birthday table and showed me how foolish my patience had looked to everyone else. I said it quietly. So quietly, in fact, that if the room had still been noisy, people might have missed it. But the room wasn't noisy anymore. It was one of those rare family silences, so complete that every small sound suddenly matters. The scrape of a fork against a plate, a child's distant laugh from the next room, the hum of the refrigerator, somebody swallowing too hard. And into that silence, I looked at my son and asked, "What house?" That was the turning point. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. There was no thunder in my voice, no accusation, no old man rage, just 3 words. But those 3 words did something more powerful than shouting ever could have. They made it impossible for anyone at that table to pretend I did not know, impossible for anyone to keep hiding behind the idea that this was some muddled misunderstanding or delayed conversation. The minute I said, "What house?" the room had to confront the truth in its naked form. Everyone else at that table knew something about my life that I did not. My son's face changed first. I will never forget that. There are some expressions you only see when a person realizes too late how bad their silence has become. He looked like the floor had dropped out from under him, not because he was learning anything new, but because he suddenly understood that I was learning, that the lie he had been living beside for months, maybe so long it had started to feel manageable to him, had just become visible in the cruelest way possible. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then, exactly the way the thumbnail promises, he did not look at me. He looked at Sarah. That look was everything. In 1 second, it confirmed what my body had already felt. This was not an accidental delay, not a forgotten update, not some sweet unfinished project I had misunderstood. This was a truth managed between husband and wife, the decision, a silence, a deception with two people standing behind it. And the moment his eyes cut to her instead of me, I understood that I was not at the center of the decision they had made. I was the person they made it about without ever fully including me. Her face went pale in a way that almost frightened me, not because I cared about her comfort in that moment, but because human beings only lose color that fast when something real has broken loose. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak either. For a second, she looked less like my daughter-in-law and more like a person standing in front of a door she had spent too long holding shut. I remember thinking before any real explanation came that guilt has a body language of its own. It cannot hide once the lie has slipped into daylight. Everyone else at the table felt it too. You could see it in the way people suddenly became very interested in their plates, their napkins, their coffee cups. Adults get so awkward around exposed family truths. It's almost embarrassing how quickly people retreat into useless stillness when honesty would require them to take a side. My grandson, thank God, had wandered off with one of his new toys and was too busy to understand what had just happened. But the grown-ups, every one of them knew. Maybe not every detail yet, maybe not the full story, but enough. Enough to know I had just asked the one question no one wanted to answer. And for those few seconds after I asked it, I became aware of my own body in a way that I almost never am. The way my hands had gone still, the way my chest felt strangely hollow, as if something inside me was bracing before impact. The way age suddenly makes a man feel visible in all the wrong ways. His slowness, his dependence, his hope. People talk a lot about the fear of getting old as if it's mostly about health or money or dying, but there's another fear that doesn't get named enough. The fear of becoming easy to arrange around, easy to lie to, easy to keep comfortable with partial truths because everyone assumes you won't make trouble if the full truth would inconvenience them. Sitting there in that silence, I felt that fear rise in me with a force I did not expect, not because I was weak, because I realized all at once how long my own son had been counting on my goodness to keep me in the dark. David finally found his voice, but it came thin. "Dad, I thought..." And then he stopped, because what exactly was he going to say? "I thought you knew? I thought we told you? I thought this would never come out at the table on a child's birthday?" Lies collapse like that. They can survive in vagueness for months, years even, but when they are forced into plain language, they suddenly become much harder to dress up. "I thought" was all he had at first, and even he seemed to hear how pathetic it sounded. I kept my eyes on him and repeated, still calm, "What house, David?" Using his name changed something. It pushed the room further out of that soft family fog and into reality. Fathers don't always say their sons' full names in moments like that, unless they are asking for something deeper than an explanation. I was asking him to step out behind the managed version of events and answer me as a man, as my son, as the boy I had once taught not to lie when the truth was hard. His jaw tightened. Sarah finally moved then, not towards me, but towards him in the smallest way, like she was trying to control the landing before being obvious about it. That movement said as much as anything else. She was trying to shape the truth before it fell too hard. But it was too late for that. The lie had already cracked. They could only choose now to keep insulting me with partial answers or say what they had done. And that, I think, is why the turning point hurt more than the full truth that came later. Because a hidden house was one thing, the reason I wasn't in it would turn out to be far more revealing than any blueprint ever could be. And when that truth finally came out at that birthday table, it did not just answer my question, it told me exactly what place I had been given in my son's new life. There was maybe a 10-second stretch there where nobody breathed properly. At least that's how it felt. David looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the table. One of the relatives cleared their cloth and then thought better of saying anything. I sat there inside a stillness I did not recognize in myself. It wasn't calm exactly. It was something harder. The kind of stillness that comes when pain has gone too deep too quickly for anger to reach it in time. And then Sarah, in a voice that sounded unlike her usual polished one, said, "We were going to tell you." There are sentences that only make the hurt worse because they reveal how long the truth has been standing nearby waiting for your permission to arrive. We were going to tell you. Not, we didn't mean for this to happen. Not, there was a misunderstanding. Not, I'm sorry. We were going to tell you. Which means they knew I didn't know. Which means every week that passed after that became a choice. Her saying those words out loud made the room tilt into a new kind of honesty. Ugly honesty, but honesty all the same. It was no longer a question of whether there had been a secret. It was a question of how big it was and how long they had expected me to live outside it. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and I think that was the first time she fully saw that I was not going to save her from this by staying polite and confused. I still didn't raise my voice, I still didn't throw the table into chaos, but the old soft fatherly instinct to smooth things over for everyone else was starting to slip away. In its place was something sadder and clearer, the beginning of a man realizing that the people he loved had built comfort for themselves inside my ignorance. That was the turning point. Not the whole truth spilling out yet, not the justifications, not the apologies that would come too late. The turning point was that precise instant between question and explanation when everyone in the room understood the shape of what had been done. My son had promised me a house, a real one. At some point it had been built or planned or finished enough for him to speak of it as fact. I was not in it. I had not known why. And instead of facing me like a son and telling me, he had looked to his wife as if the person he owed the most immediate allegiance in that moment was the one standing beside the lie, not the man sitting across from it. That changes something in a father. There are betrayals that make you angry, and there are betrayals that age you in real time. This one did both, but first, it aged me. I felt older in those seconds than I had that morning. Older not because of my body, but because of what I now understood about the emotional math of the people I loved. Their comfort outranked my right to the truth. Once a parent sees that clearly, really sees it, some innocence never comes back. And still, even then, I was not ready for how much worse the full explanation would make it. Because a hidden house was one thing, the reason I wasn't in it would turn out to be far more revealing than any blueprint ever could be. And when that truth finally came out at that birthday table, it did not just answer my question, it told me exactly what place I had been given in my son's new life.
Once Sarah said, "We were going to tell you," there was no real way back. That sentence shut the last door on any illusion that this might still somehow be a misunderstanding. It confirmed what the room already knew and what my heart had just begun to understand. There was a truth. I had been kept outside it, and the people who claimed they loved me had learned to live comfortably beside that fact for way too long. The air in the room changed after she said it. Not louder, stranger. Like all the furniture had suddenly become witness instead of background. You could feel the adults recalculating in their heads. What had been said, what had now been admitted, what might still be hidden, and how ugly the full answer was going to sound once it was dragged all the way into the light. I looked at David first, because whatever role Sarah had played in this, he was my son.
He was the one who had sat on my porch 2 years ago and said I wouldn't have to live alone anymore. He was the one who'd shown me plans. He was the one who'd looked me in the eye and made a promise in that soft, sincere voice sons use when they know they are speaking to the deepest, oldest trust a father has. So I asked him, "Built for me?" I didn't even say the whole sentence. I didn't have to. The words were heavy enough on their own. Built for me? And he still couldn't look me properly. That was the part that cut almost more than anything. A grown man, my own son, sitting at a birthday table unable to hold his father's gaze because the truth was that shameful. David rubbed his face once hard, like he could wipe the moment away if he pressed hard enough. Then he said, "Dad, it's just, things changed." Things changed. That was his first real offering. Not honesty, not apology, a phrase, a little neutral phrase men use when they are trying to soften something they know is ugly. Things changed. As if we were discussing weather or work schedules or plans for a holiday, not a promise made to an old man who had spent 2 winters waiting for a home that had already been given away. I felt something in me go very still at those words. Because once you hear a person try to shrink your hurt into logistics, you understand exactly how long they've been translating your humanity into inconvenience. Sarah stepped in then, faster than she probably intended, the way people do when they sense the weaker liar might collapse and expose too much, too badly. She said, "My mother needed somewhere to stay. It was temporary at first." Temporary. That word. It's amazing how many betrayals enter a family wearing temporary like a disguise. Just for now, just until things settle, just until she gets back on her feet. As if temporary decisions still reveal permanent truths about whose comfort matters most when things get difficult. I looked at her and waited, because she had not said the whole thing yet, not the part that mattered most, not why I was never told. She kept going, voice tight now, trying to sound reasonable. She had nowhere else to go. We thought it would be easier this way until we figured things out. We thought, easier this way. There it was, the language of shared decision and managed discomfort, the language of 2 people who'd built a life together and decided somewhere along the line that the old man on the outskirts of it could be kept calm with vague assurances while the real decisions were made elsewhere. Easier this way for whom? That was the question hanging over the whole table. Easier for Sarah because her mother was close and secure. Easier for David because he didn't have to fight his wife or tell his father the truth. Easier for the household because no one had to endure one painful conversation. Easier for everyone but the one person whose name had first been attached to that house. And then, like a fool maybe, or just a father still hoping there was some version of this that might hurt less, I asked the question that opened the whole thing the rest of the way. I said, "How long?" That was when the room really broke. Because duration changes everything. A bad decision made last week still has the softness of panic around it. A lie maintained for 18 months has structure. It has intention. It has habits. It means birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sunday lunches all took place under its roof. It means every smile from my son carried a shadow. It means the waiting was not just sad, it was orchestrated. David answered this time, barely above a murmur. About 1.5 years. I don't know what my face looked like then. I've wondered. Did I look shocked? Broken? Did I go blank? Because inside, what I felt was not dramatic at first. It was a kind of dropping away, like a floor giving out in slow motion. 18 months. 18 months of me driving home to a drafty trailer while a finished house sat on my son's property with someone else's curtains in the windows. 18 months of excuses. 18 months of me deciding not to ask because I didn't want to pressure him. 18 months of him letting me believe there was still a future being built for me that had already been handed over to someone else. There are hurts you can measure in money. This was not one of them. This was measured in every unnecessary mile I drove, every lonely night, every pipe I thawed by myself, every moment I sat alone and told myself not to take it personally that the project kept getting delayed. The pain of that is hard to explain unless you've reached an age where you know your later years are not endless. At 62, 18 months is not a small misunderstanding. 18 months is time. Time your body feels. Time your hopes organize around. Time you do not get back. And still, even then, I did not yell. I think everyone at the table was waiting for that, maybe even bracing for it, because anger would have made emotional sense. Anger would have let them move into familiar positions, defensive, apologetic, explanatory, maybe even self-righteous if I got too sharp. But I didn't give them that. I was too hurt for anger yet. Hurt had gone deeper and cleaner than that. It had reached the place in me where dignity lives. The old, private place a father carries his son all his life, even after the son becomes a man across the table from him. So I asked one more thing. And nobody thought to tell thee? It was not a loud question, but it seemed to make everybody shrink. Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Not housing policy, not emergency family arrangements, not whose mother deserved shelter more. The truth. Nobody thought to tell me. Nobody thought the old man deserved direct speech. And because there is no good answer to that question, the room gave me exactly what people give when the answer is too ugly to speak plainly. Sarah started trying to explain again. Her mother had nowhere to go. It was never meant to be permanent. They were going to revisit it. They thought they were sparing me disappointment until they had another plan. All of it just washed over me by then. Because once someone has shown you they can live comfortably beside your exclusion, the actual arrangement of their excuses stops mattering quite so much. Excuses are details. Character is structure. And the structure I just saw was this. When pressured, my son had chosen the easier piece of his house over the harder honesty owed to his father. That knowledge settled into me in a way I could feel physically. Not hot, cold, permanent. Not rage, but distance beginning. The kind of distance that doesn't need slammed doors or dramatic speeches. The kind that starts the moment you realize your heart must learn a new way to hold someone because the old trusting way is no longer safe. And in the middle of that birthday table, with cake drying at the edges and coffee going lukewarm and nobody knowing how to recover the evening, I understood something that would stay with me long after the details blurred. The worst thing they had taken from me was not the house. It was the right to decide what I could endure, because they never gave me the truth early enough to endure it with dignity.
After I said, "You could have just told me I wasn't welcome," no one had anything left that could improve the truth. They still had words, of course. People always do. Explanations, justifications, late apologies trying to rush in and soften what months or years of silence have already hardened. But none of it could really touch the center of what had happened. The room knew that. I knew that. Even David knew it by then, which is why he finally stopped talking. There's a point in some family betrayals where language itself becomes a little indecent. Not because words are useless, but because too many of them start sounding like people trying to climb back over a line they themselves chose to cross slowly, carefully, and repeatedly. So I didn't argue. That surprises some people when I tell this story. They expect a speech. They expect a dramatic exit. They expect the old father to stand up, throw down a napkin, and tell everybody what kind of people they are. But that's not what happened. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I was too hurt. Or maybe some part of me understood that if I started speaking from that wound before I had held it properly in my own hands, I would say things meant to bleed and not things meant to last. And I didn't want blood. Not on my grandson's birthday. Not in front of a child whose joy had done nothing to deserve becoming the backdrop of adult cowardice. So I did something far simpler, and I think it unsettled them more than anger would have. I picked up my fork. I took one small bite of cake. I chewed it, swallowed it, put the fork down. Not because I was hungry anymore. I wasn't. But because I needed them to see that I was not going to perform a collapse for them.
I was not going to save them from shame by becoming hysterical, and I was not going to save them from shame by pretending it hadn't mattered. I was just going to sit in the truth long enough for it to become real in the room. Sometimes dignity looks almost absurd in moments like that. A man eating birthday cake after finding out his son lied to him for 18 months. But that small act steadied me. It let me stay my own man for one more minute before I had to leave. The first person I looked for after that was my grandson. He came racing back in with some toy dinosaur, all bright eyes and breathless excitement. And for a terrible second I thought, this child is the only pure thing left in this room tonight. He climbed into my side like he always did, talking too fast about something I can't even remember now. And I kissed the top of his head and listened, as if I could anchor myself in his innocence. That was the hardest part of leaving. Not the lie, not even the drive home. It was knowing I had to separate my love for him from the hurt attached to the house where he lived, and that would take time. I told him happy birthday properly, really properly. I looked him in the eye, smiled as much as I could manage, handed him the envelope with the little cash gift I'd brought, and made sure my voice was warm enough that he would remember none of what had just happened behind the adults' faces. Children should not have to carry grown people's moral failures in their happiest memories. I believe that with all my heart. Whatever broke that night, I would not hand any of it to him if I could help. Then I stood up. Slowly, because my knee was stiff, and because old hurt makes a man move even slower. David stood too, almost automatically, like part of him still believed there was time to stop what was happening. But I didn't look at him right away. I shook the hand of one relative, touched another lightly on the shoulder, nodded to Sarah's mother because I was raised with manners, and because I was not going to let anyone rewrite that moment later as me being rude. Then I picked up my jacket. That was all. No scene, no dramatic declaration. Just a man getting ready to leave a house that had told him more clearly than any direct statement ever had where he stood in its real hierarchy. David followed me to the door. Of course he did. That's how guilt behaves. It wakes up only once consequences start putting on their coat. Behind us, I could feel the room still holding itself awkwardly together, adults trying to remember how to breathe and talk and cut cake while pretending nothing too important had just changed forever. At the door, he said my name. Dad. That one word held so much in it. Panic, shame, pleading, the sudden childishness of a grown man who has just remembered he still wants to be forgiven by the person he has hurt. I turned then. I don't know what he expected to find on my face. Rage, maybe? Disappointment? Maybe tears? What I gave him was simpler. Tiredness. The kind that reaches beyond a long day and settles into the bones. I said, "Go back inside. It's your son's birthday." That was all. No lecture, no opening for him to spill apologies onto the porch while the guests listened through the walls, no permission for him to make me comfort him about what he had done. Just a boundary. The first clean one of the whole night. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Maybe he understood then that some moments cannot be repaired in doorways. Maybe he knew anything he said would sound too late because it was. Maybe he finally felt in his own body how deep the quiet had become between us. I don't know. I just know he stepped back, and I walked out to my truck alone. That drive home is still with me in a way that is hard to explain. I've driven that 45-minute stretch so many times over the years that it usually passes almost without thought. Headlights, dark road, familiar turns, old reflexes. But that night, every mile felt newly cruel. Not because the road had changed, but because now I knew with absolute certainty that I had been driving it all that time while a different life, one my own son had once invited me into, was already occupied by someone else. Every red light felt like a memory. Every curve reminded me of all the evenings I had waved goodbye, climbed into that truck and told myself not to mind the distance because soon things would change. Soon was a lie. Or maybe not a lie in the beginning, but certainly a lie by the end. And I had been living inside it like a fool, because fathers are often the last people to accept that their children can become practiced at avoiding them emotionally. I did not cry on that drive. That may sound hard or cold, but it wasn't either. I was simply beyond tears in that moment, too hollow for them. Tears are for when pain still feels active enough to move. What I felt was quieter, a settling, like something was placed in me that would take a long time to dissolve, if it ever did. It wasn't hate. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't even anger, not mostly. It was recognition, the kind that changes the temperature of love without extinguishing it. I still loved my son. I still would have done anything for that boy if his life were in danger. But after that night, I no longer loved him with the same innocence. And innocence, once gone between parent and child, leaves a silence that nothing else fits quite the same way. The next day, David called. Before 9 in the morning, that alone told me how badly he had slept. His voice sounded rough, like a man who had spent the night talking to himself and losing every argument. He started apologizing almost immediately, not gracefully, not with some perfect speech, in fragments. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to happen like that. I should have told you. You didn't deserve that." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I think he needed to hear himself say the words more than I needed to hear them. Sometimes the child finally arrives at honesty only after the lie has already taken what it wanted. And then came the offers. That part was almost inevitable. "We'll move her out. We can fix this. I can build another one. You can still come live here if you want." I heard it all in one long stream of guilt trying to transform itself into solutions. But by then, the solutions were too late for the thing I had actually lost. A house can be built. Walls can go up. Money can be spent. Plans can be redrawn. But trust, once it has been taught to stand outside the door for 18 months while everyone else pretends not to see it waiting, does not return because somebody suddenly discovers urgency after being caught. I let him finish. Then I said, "No." Just that. At first. Quietly. Firmly. He kept talking, as if maybe he had not heard me clearly, so I said it again. "No, David, I don't need a house." There was a long silence then, and in that silence I think he finally understood the thing he had missed all along. The house had never just been a house, and now that he had made it into a lie, building me another one would not undo what he had taught me about my place in his life. So I told him the only thing that mattered enough to be said. I didn't need a guest house nearly as much as I needed to know you would tell me the truth before everyone at the table already knew it but me. He cried then, or close enough to it that his voice broke and words started failing him. That hurt, too, because no good father likes hearing his son in pain, even when the son has caused the damage. That reflex never fully leaves you. But I did not rescue him from that. That was part of the resolution, too. I had spent too many years saving him from uncomfortable feelings before they fully reached him. This one needed to reach him. Not to punish him, to teach him what silence had cost him. He asked what he could do. People always ask that after the wound is visible, as if repair is a list of tasks waiting to be assigned. I told him the truth. Nothing, right now. Not because nothing would ever matter again, but because healing done too quickly often becomes another version of the same avoidance. A son rushing to repair the optics of his own guilt is not the same as a son learning to carry truth properly going forward. I needed time. More than that, I needed reality to stop bending around his need for immediate forgiveness. The weeks after that were quieter than anyone expected. David called more often at first, texted, offered groceries, repairs, visits. I accepted very little, not out of spite, out of self-protection. I needed to learn what my own love.
I had to learn what my own love sounded like when it was no longer running ahead to make excuses for him. I still went to see my grandson, but less casually, less as the man always available, more carefully. The relationship didn't explode. That's important. Some people hear stories like this and expect total estrangement, slam doors, dramatic declarations that a father is done forever. Real life is often sadder and more subtle than that. I did not stop loving my son. I simply stopped trusting him in the same instinctive way. And that kind of change creates distance, even when everybody remains polite.
You could feel it in the small things, the pauses on the phone, the way our conversations lost some of their old ease, the way he now over-explained ordinary things as if trying too hard to prove he was being transparent, the way I no longer volunteered much about myself beyond the basics. I'm fine, doing all right, truck's running. Simple answers, safe answers. We were still father and son, but now there was a room inside that relationship that had gone cold, and neither of us knew fully how to heat it again. Maybe the most honest part of the resolution is this. I did not become bitter. I became careful. There's a difference. Bitterness turns the whole heart hard. Carefulness only closes the hand around the places that have already been bruised. I was still grandpa, still dad, still the man who showed up when it truly mattered. But I was no longer the man who built his emotional world on what my son might mean someday if given enough time. I moved my trust out of the future and back into what people actually did. That may sound sad, and maybe it is, but it was also freeing in its own way. I stopped waiting. That was the real resolution. I stopped waiting for the house, obviously, but more than that, I stopped waiting for my son to become the version of himself I had been protecting in my mind. After that night, I let him be exactly who he had shown himself to be. Not evil, not heartless, but weak where truth becomes costly. And once I accepted that, I could love him more honestly. At a distance, yes. With clearer eyes, absolutely. But honestly. And so the story did not end with me moving into a little house behind oak trees. It ended with me staying in my trailer a while longer and understanding finally that old age does not only ask you to accept physical limits. Sometimes it asks you to accept emotional truths you spent years hoping your children would spare you. That was mine. My son had not wanted to hurt me, maybe, but he had wanted even more to avoid an uncomfortable truth. And in the end, that avoidance cost us something no house could ever repair. So yes, he called. He apologized. He offered to fix it. And yes, I said no. Not because I didn't love him, but because what I needed from him was never a building. It was the dignity of being told the truth before everyone at the table already knew it but me.
If you ask me now what hurt the most, people usually expect me to say the house. They expect the answer to be practical, the broken promise, the unfairness, the idea that there was a warm little place on my son's property where I could have lived close to family, and instead someone else got it while I stayed in a trailer pretending I didn't mind. And yes, that hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. At my age, comfort matters. Proximity matters. The body starts keeping score in ways youth never has to think about. Cold sinks deeper into your bones. Distance takes more out of your back. Stairs feel steeper. Loneliness feels less romantic and more structural. So yes, the house mattered. But it was never the deepest wound. The deepest wound was this. My son decided I was easier to lie to than to speak honestly with. That's the thing that stays with me. Not the loss of a building, the loss of standing in his life as someone's heart deserved direct truth. He made a calculation, whether he ever admitted it to himself or not. He decided that the discomfort of telling me plans had changed was greater than the discomfort of letting me go on believing something that was no longer true. And once a parent understands that their child can make that calculation about them, something changes. Not always in a loud way, sometimes very quietly, but permanently. I think that's why this story has never really been about real estate for me. It's about what children assume older parents can absorb without question. It's about the silent categories people put us into as we age. He'll understand. He won't ask. He doesn't need much. He'll be grateful for whatever we can manage. Those assumptions can sound kind from the outside, almost caring, but underneath them is something colder. It is the beginning of not fully seeing your parent as a whole person anymore, not as someone with pride, with feelings, with dignity, and the right to be included in the truth even when the truth is disappointing. And once that starts happening, the parent is not exactly being rejected, but they are being handled, managed, positioned. And there is a kind of sorrow in realizing your child has become skilled at handling your love instead of honoring it. I know a lot of parents, especially fathers, understand that sorrow even if they never say it out loud. Men of my generation were not raised to narrate our emotional injuries with much detail. We were taught to work, to endure, to keep moving, to let silence cover what hurt if naming it would burden someone else. A lot of us became very good at making ourselves easy to love because we asked for so little in return. We paid bills, fixed things, showed up, didn't complain. And then, later in life, we are sometimes shocked to discover that the children raised inside that steadiness have mistaken it for invulnerability. They think because we don't demand, we don't need. Because we don't pressure, we won't be crushed by being left out. Because we remain polite, we can survive being lied to as long as the lie is dressed in enough concern. That is a dangerous misunderstanding. Good fathers usually don't demand houses. Most of us are not built that way. We don't want to become burdens. We don't want our children to feel trapped by gratitude. We tell ourselves that if they're happy, if they're decent, if they're building lives of their own, then that is enough reward for what we did. And in many ways, maybe it is. But there is one thing even the quietest good father should never be expected to live without, and that is truth. Not comfort, not constant attention, not repayment. Truth. Because truth is the minimum dignity one adult owes another, especially when that other adult once carried you through the years when you could not carry yourself. That is what I wish more people understood about aging parents. We are not asking to be the center of your life forever. We know life expands. We know marriage changes loyalties. We know your children need you in ways we no longer do. We know there are practical limits to what any family can provide. Most of us understand all of that better than you think. What we cannot understand, what wounds us more deeply than many children realize, is being quietly rearranged around as if our love has made us too safe to tell the hard truth to. That is not kindness. That is cowardice using affection as cover. I've had time since then to think about Sarah too, and about her mother, and about how families decide whose need gets called urgent and whose need gets called manageable. That's another painful truth in this story. Need is never assessed in a vacuum. It is filtered through power, through proximity, through who makes more noise, through who is harder to disappoint. Sarah's mother was close, immediate, pressing. I was patient, far away, and unlikely to demand clarity. So one need became a crisis, and the other became a delay. One person got a key and a front step and curtains in the window. The other got another season of vague promises and a nicer blanket for Christmas. That is how families often work when no one is brave enough to speak plainly. The person most likely to forgive is the person most likely to be sacrificed quietly. And maybe that is the lesson I carry now more than any other. Forgiveness should never be mistaken for permission. Just because an old father will probably still answer the phone does not mean it costs him nothing to be lied to. Just because a parent is gentle does not mean they are less injured by being excluded from the truth. Just because someone will likely understand does not mean they should be the one chosen to absorb the moral cost of everyone else's easier path. There is another part of this that matters to me too, especially when I think about younger people watching a story like mine. Children, even adult children, often imagine betrayal in very dramatic terms. Affairs, theft, addiction, violence. Some big, obvious fracture everyone can point to and agree was wrong. But in families, some of the deepest betrayals are much quieter than that.
They happen in postponements, in omissions, in never-quite conversations, in promises that are not formally broken, just slowly abandoned while the person who trusted them is kept warm with enough hope not to ask harder questions. That kind of betrayal leaves a strange wound, because from the outside, life still looks functional. Dinners still happen, birthdays still happen, grandchildren still laugh, texts still get exchanged. It can take a long time for the person being hurt to fully trust that they are being hurt at all. And when the truth finally comes, people often rush to the practical repair because practical repair looks active and generous. We'll move her out, we'll build another one, we'll fix it, we'll make room. But some things cannot be fixed at the level where they broke. If the injury happened in dignity, the repair has to happen in character. If the injury happened because someone chose comfort over truth, then the repair is not another project. It is a complete change in how that person carries honesty going forward. That kind of repair is slower, harder, less visible, and many people are not nearly as interested in it because it cannot be completed with a checkbook or a new floor plan. That was true for my son. He wanted to make amends in material ways, because material ways are something men understand. Build, move, pay, offer, rearrange. But what I needed was for him to sit with the uglier truth. He treated me like a man who would rather be lied to than made uncomfortable. Whether he intended that or not, that is what his choices said, and intentions matter less than actions when enough time has passed. I also think this story says something important about silence, my silence especially. For a long time after that dinner, I was tempted to blame myself for not pushing sooner, for not asking direct questions months earlier, for telling myself not to be a burden, for being so careful with my son's feelings that I made it possible for him to protect himself with my patience. And maybe there is some truth in that. Silence can become a hiding place not just for other people's cowardice, but also for our own fear of what truth might cost us. I was afraid, if I'm honest, afraid that if I pushed too hard, the answer would be exactly what it turned out to be, that I was not as central, not as considered, not as protected in my son's new life as I wanted to believe. Sometimes we leave questions unasked because hope, even fragile hope, feels warmer than the cold certainty of a disappointing answer. But I have become gentler with myself about that too. I did not create the lie by being trusting. I did not invite deception by being patient. The fault still belongs to the people who knew the truth and chose not to share it. That matters. Because older parents already carry enough shame around needing things at all, we do not need to add to it by acting as if being quiet somehow absolves others of their responsibility to be honest with us. But still, if there is one thing I would say to other parents after living through this, it is this: do not make yourself so easy to disappoint that people stop recognizing they are disappointing you. Ask the question, sooner if you can. Not because demanding is noble, but because clarity is. Hope without clarity can become a long hallway where other people keep passing by, waving kindly, while the door at the end has already been given to someone else. I wish I knew that sooner. I wish I trusted myself enough to ask harder questions before the truth had a chance to grow roots in silence. But regret is only useful if it turns into wisdom, and mine has.
I know now that love and self-erasure are not the same thing. I know that being a good father does not require becoming infinitely absorbent. I know that one of the saddest things a man can ever discover is not that he was denied comfort, but that the child he broke his back for would rather protect household peace than tell him one painful truth. And I know something else too. Even when that happens, a man does not have to become cruel to remain dignified. He can simply become clear. Clear about what was lost. Clear about what cannot be bought back. Clear about what he will no longer confuse with love. So when people hear my story and ask whether I ever got the house, I usually tell them no. And then I tell them that was never the real point anyway.
The house was wood and plumbing and windows and maybe, if things had gone differently, some peace in my later years. But what I really needed, and what I did not get until it was forced out at a birthday table, was the simple respect of being told the truth while I still had a chance to receive it as a man, not as the last person to learn what everyone else had already arranged around me. That is the emotional truth I live with now. The worst lies parents are ever told are not always the biggest ones. They're the quiet ones. The ones told because the child thinks the parent is too old, too gentle, too loyal, too unlikely to ask. The ones told because honesty would create a scene and silence is easier to decorate with kindness. The ones told because somebody mistakes a parent's love for unlimited emotional credit. And maybe that's what I would want any son or daughter hearing this to understand before it's too late. Your aging parent does not need perfection. They can survive disappointment. They can survive changed plans. They can survive hearing no. What they should not have to survive is being turned into the easiest person in the family to lie to. Good fathers don't demand houses. They just deserve the truth. And the saddest thing a man can ever learn is that the son he gave everything to would rather let him wait in the cold than have one honest conversation.
The weeks after that birthday dinner did not look dramatic from the outside, and maybe that is why they were so heavy. There was no explosion, no family split down the middle, no one calling me in the middle of the night to accuse me of tearing the household apart, no dramatic public scene that forced everybody to declare a side. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more permanent. The shape of things changed, the tone changed, the emotional weight of every interaction changed. That's often how family betrayal settles in, not as a fire, but as a climate. The temperature of the relationship drops, and even when people are still speaking, still showing up, still doing birthdays and holidays and practical favors, everybody can feel the cold. David called more than usual at first. That was guilt trying to become activity. He asked if I needed anything from the hardware store, offered to send someone to check on the trailer roof, wanted to know if the truck was running all right, texted me weather warnings as if forwarding rain alerts could somehow stand in for 18 months of silence. I answered politely. I did not punish him, but I also did not pretend those calls were the same thing as trust. There's a difference between contact and closeness, a big one. We still had contact. The closeness, though, had been injured at the root, and roots don't heal because the branches suddenly remember to reach. I also noticed something else almost immediately. He had become careful with me in a way that felt both loving and sad. Too careful. Like a man walking across a floor he knows he cracked. He watched his words more. He over-explained ordinary things. If he was running late, he'd say why before I even asked. If plans shifted, he'd make sure to mention it directly. If I brought up anything practical about the future, he'd answer too quickly, too fully, as if trying to prove, mostly to himself, I think, that he was not that man anymore. I appreciated the effort, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it made me feel secure. Once someone has shown you how comfortable they can become living beside a lie, their sudden transparency doesn't feel like peace right away. It feels like correction. Necessary, yes, but also late. I went to see my grandson, of course. That part never stopped. It was different, but it never stopped. Love for a child is not a switch you flick off because the adults around him have disappointed you. If anything, those visits became even more important to me because they reminded me there was still innocence somewhere in all of this. Still a small boy who loved me simply because I was grandpa, because I read stories with funny voices and fixed his toy wheels and let him sit in my truck and pretend to steer. He didn't know anything had changed, or if he sensed something, he didn't have words for it. Children often feel weather before they understand storms. There were a few moments when he asked simple questions that landed much deeper in me than he could know. Why don't you stay longer? Why don't you come over more? Can you sleep here sometime? I always answered gently, maybe one day, buddy. Grandpa's got to head home. We'll see.
But inside, those questions echoed against everything I now knew. He had no idea there once was a place built close enough for those little wishes to have come true. The trailer felt different after that night too. Not physically, not at first. Same old steps, same old hum of the refrigerator, same places where the floor gave just a little under my feet. But emotionally, it changed. Before, it had been lonely but temporary in my mind, a place I was enduring while waiting for something better that had already been promised. After the birthday dinner, it became what it really was, home, for now and maybe longer, without the cushion of expectation. In a strange way, that was painful and freeing at the same time. Painful because hope had finally been stripped off the situation, and hope can be warm even if it's misleading. Freeing because I was no longer arranging my emotional life around a future that belonged to someone else. I stopped looking at the trailer like a waiting room. It simply became the place where I lived, and there was a relief in that honesty I didn't expect. I started fixing small things I'd let go while I was still waiting. That surprised me. I repaired a loose kitchen cabinet, replaced a torn screen, patched a draft near the back door, bought a sturdier space heater before winter. On the surface, none of it meant much, but inwardly those changes mattered because they marked a shift. I was no longer arranging my suspended animation for the life my son had once described to me. I was returning to the life I actually had. There's dignity in that too, though it comes wrapped in sadness sometimes. In old age, accepting reality is not the same as giving up. Sometimes it's the only way to stop someone else's avoidance from continuing to govern your emotional world. Sarah and I became more polite with each other, in a way that felt sad. She was warmer to me for a while, but in that careful, slightly strained way people become when they know they've been seen too clearly. She asked after my health more, packed leftovers for me more deliberately. Once or twice she mentioned her mother getting sorted out, as if I might be soothed by hearing there was movement in the situation that once had been hidden from me. I was never rude to her. I didn't want to turn every interaction into a courtroom, but I also stopped doing the little emotional labor I used to do for her, the reassuring smiles, the quick easing of awkwardness, the pretending not to notice tension when it was obviously in the room. If she felt my reserve, that was fair. Reserve was honest. As for Sarah's mother, our interactions became simpler than they had ever been. Maybe honesty, even ugly honesty, sometimes clears away the false politeness people were hiding behind. She was embarrassed around me after the truth came out. That much was obvious. I think she knew enough to be uncomfortable and not enough to fully own responsibility, which is a miserable place for a person to stand. She wasn't cruel to me. In fact, if anything, she became gentler. But gentleness after benefit has a strange flavor. It can feel less like kindness and more like shame trying to behave well. I didn't hold long conversations with her after that. There was no point. She hadn't made the promise. She had simply lived inside the space where the promise had once pointed. The deeper grief remained with my son. That grief didn't feel the same every day. Some days I was just practical, busy, tired, fixing things, paying bills, grocery shopping, going on with the ordinary mechanics of being alive. Other days, the sadness caught me from a strange angle. I'd be sitting in my recliner at night and remember the look on David's face when he asked the question at the table before he knew I didn't know. Or I'd pass a little prefabbed guest cottage on a road somewhere and feel that sharp inward twist all over again. Or I'd hear someone mention multi-generational living in a casual, hopeful way and think some people really do get to move closer to family because they are invited honestly. Those moments could still sting, not because I wanted to sit and suffer, but because hurt has a way of revisiting through ordinary objects once it knows where to find you. What changed most in me, though, was not anger. It was orientation. I no longer instinctively placed my son in the emotional center of my future in the same way he used to. That may be hard for some people to understand if they've never had to redraw the map of a relationship that still exists, but no longer feels morally safe in all the old places. I still loved him. I still wanted his life to go well. I still would have shown up in an emergency without hesitation, but I stopped handing him the quiet authority he used to have inside me. I stopped shaping my hopes around what he might someday do if enough guilt or time or maturity finally reached him. I let him become, in a painful but necessary way, one adult man in my life, instead of the unquestioned keeper of my emotional home. That sounds colder than it felt. In truth, it felt saner. I think this is one of the less talked about realities of betrayal between parents and adult children. The relationship doesn't always end. Sometimes it simply loses its innocence. The child remains your child, but not in the same unguarded place as before. Love survives, but trust changes rooms. And because our culture is more comfortable with stories of total estrangement or total reconciliation, people often don't know what to do with that middle space. But that middle space is where many families live, after the worst thing has been said or discovered, and nobody wants to burn the whole bridge down. You keep talking, you keep attending birthdays, you keep asking about school and weather and work, and underneath all of it, there's a quieter knowledge now, a distance that doesn't shout but never fully leaves. The strangest part of the aftermath was how much more clearly I began seeing other families too. Once something like this happens, you start noticing all the little ways people manage older parents, the half-truths, the softened exclusions, the assumptions that mom or dad doesn't need to know yet, doesn't need every detail, doesn't have to be consulted because it will only upset them. Some of that comes from genuine care, maybe. Some of it comes from underestimating how much older people already know about disappointment. We have lived through enough of it to survive hearing the truth, often better than our children can survive telling it. That's the irony. The old are often stronger with reality than the young are with honesty. I became more outspoken with a few friends after that, not dramatically, but more honest than before. A widower from church once mentioned his daughter kept promising to help him move closer to her and then changing the subject every time he asked. Before all this, I probably would have patted him on the back and said, "Give it time." But afterwards, I said, "Ask her directly. Don't let her keep you waiting in politeness." He looked surprised, maybe because men like us are so used to offering patience as wisdom. But patience can become a trap if it only protects other people from the discomfort of being clear. I think I knew that in my bones now. David and I did eventually find a rhythm again, of a kind. Not the old rhythm, that one was gone, but a new one, more deliberate. He called before dropping by. He followed through on what he said more carefully. He stopped making broad promises he couldn't fully control. In some ways, the betrayal forced him to grow up in relation to me. That sounds harsh, but I mean it honestly. For much of his adult life, he had still treated me with the unexamined confidence children often carry towards steady parents. Dad will be there. Dad will understand. Dad won't push. Dad's love can absorb my unfinished emotional work. After the birthday dinner, I don't think he could believe in that version of me so casually anymore. He had seen what his silence cost, and whether from guilt or love, and both, he started carrying that knowledge more carefully. Did that repair everything? No. Real life is not a neat moral diagram. There were still awkward holidays, still moments when I saw Sarah tense slightly if housing or aging parents came up in conversation, still visits where I could sense everyone trying not to step on the memory of that night. But there were also ordinary kindnesses again. My grandson growing older and louder and sweeter, David helping me replace the trailer steps without being asked, a Sunday afternoon where we watched a game and spoke almost normally for an hour before the sadness returned at the edges. That's what aftermath looks like when a family does not fully break but cannot fully go back either. It is patchwork. It is uneven. It is a mix of regret, effort, tenderness, distance, and small repairs that never quite erase the original crack. If you want to know the truest thing about the aftermath, it is this. I stopped waiting for one big moment of redemption. I stopped imagining that someday David would say exactly the perfect thing and the whole hurt would finally make complete sense and vanish. Life rarely gives us that kind of symmetry. Instead, what it gave me was smaller and harder and maybe more useful. It gave me clearer eyes. It taught me what my son was capable of when caught between truth and convenience. It taught me what I was capable of surviving without becoming cruel. And it taught me that sometimes the only real way forward is to keep loving someone while no longer lying to yourself about who they have shown themselves to be.
That may not sound like a triumphant ending. Maybe it isn't. But it is an honest one. An honesty I have learned is worth more than a little house behind some oak trees if the house comes wrapped in silence, and the honesty arrives only after a room full of people has already watched your face learn it for the first time.